Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs. Buenos días, señoras y señores. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the International Civil Aviation Organization's 40th Assembly. My name is Sung-Hoon Kim, and I'll be your MC for this event. Over the next 9 days, we have 67 presentations for you from aviation professionals within our organization and in the private industry. I'd like to remind you that you're seeing all of this live. So for those people who are in the audience, please make sure to put your cell phones on vibrate mode. Now, once the presentation is finished, or during the presentation, if the speaker so wishes, please make sure to come up to the mic and get close so you can ask your questions. And for those who want to access these presentations, please make sure to drop off your business cards at the back into the little bowl. Now, this is day one, session number 6, and we've had 5 great presentations thus far. Normally, I would say if you miss this, that's really bad. But in this case, you can go to YouTube on the ICAO channel and look for the different presentations we had today. Now, I mentioned that our goal at the International Civil Aviation Organization is to make our sky travels safer. And to talk more about the aviation security policy development, our next speaker, Steve Berti, Chief of Aviation Security Policy Section, will be here to provide you with more details. So without further ado, please welcome Steve Berti.
Thank you. Good morning all, and welcome to the SkyTalks session on aviation security policy development, which is how ICAO sets the global rules with regard to aviation security. I understand I have about 25 minutes, but I hope to be even shorter than that because I think it's much more interesting to actually have some discussion rather than me standing up here talking to you. So please do prepare any questions you may have as we go along, and there will be, I hope, plenty of time at the end to discuss them. So, aviation security policy. Why is this important? Does all this stuff matter? We've all experienced this airport, haven't we, recently? Crowded security checkpoints, waiting in line, taking things out of bags, putting them into the boxes, putting liquids into plastic bags and doing them separately, hats, coats, gloves, shoes, taking off. Surely there's nothing more to add, right? We're doing everything we can, right? Well, unfortunately, there's always something we can add or that needs to be added from time to time. And I'll explain why and how that happens over the next few minutes. But first, I'd like to start by explaining my experience and why I think this is important, why this is important to me personally. It all started for me just as we were beginning to wind down for Christmas. On 21st of December, in fact, 3 minutes past 7, I remember, in 1988. So it's a long time ago now, but I remember it as if it was yesterday. An explosion caused an aircraft to disintegrate, having left London's Heathrow Airport less than an hour previously, heading towards New York. It disintegrated over the south of Scotland, scattering debris over many hundreds of miles. The largest and heaviest pieces fell in and around a town called Lockerbie in the south of Scotland. The event I'm talking about was thus associated with that place and is sometimes referred to as the Lockerbie bombing, the Lockerbie disaster, the Lockerbie tragedy, and so on. Otherwise known by its flight number, which was Pan Am 103. I was at that time a junior officer within the UK's Department of Transport. And I had found myself in what I felt had to be the most interesting part of the Department of Transport, the Air Accidents Investigation Branch. Certainly it's a time when I still remember very fondly my time there, despite the tragedies I was faced with. So here are some slides, some photos you may be familiar with. This is the iconic picture of the Lockerbie event. The front portion of the aircraft, which landed in a field in a place known as Tundergarth, just a short distance from Lockerbie. I remember standing roughly where that police officer is standing right now and surveying the wreckage that day, as I said, just like it was yesterday. Certainly the most memorable Christmas I've ever spent, that's for sure. But this was a scene with bodies and debris scattered over hundreds of meters from my worst nightmares. And that first evening, when we got back to our hotel, we'd be lucky to find accommodation for quite a large team that came up from Farnborough that day. And we had decided we had earned ourselves a shot of Scotland's most famous product in the bar, nice Scotch whisky that evening. After a very long day's work out in the fields and seeing all these things, which was quite shocking, as I'm sure you can imagine. So that's how I find myself standing at the bar of this hotel, thinking about the day's events, and we were discussing what we can do the following day. I happened to be stood next to the head aviation pathologist at the time. And I asked him the first thought that came into my head. All those poor people on that plane, I was wondering, did they suffer? Would they have died instantly? Or was it just when they hit the ground? I know it's perhaps a bit of a macabre kind of question, but it's what occurred to me having seen that wreckage. And I do admit that sometimes I wish I hadn't asked that question, because he did give me a very interesting answer. So he paused and thought about it for a while and then said, well, some would have died instantly due to the explosion, depending on where they were sitting. Others may have died from debris which was swirling around in the air. You can imagine an aircraft disintegrating in the air. It causes a lot of dangerous elements, which obviously people died as a result of that. But most would have probably lost consciousness. I thought to myself, well, thank God. After a few seconds, they'd lost consciousness. And he paused. But then they would have regained consciousness at a height of approximately 5,000 feet. And that's the memory that sticks with me, which comes to me sometimes when I'm flying and we experience some turbulence on the aircraft. My thought goes back to that day and those poor people on that day. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is why I think this is important, why it's important to me personally, to prevent this kind of thing ever happening again and to prevent others suffering that same fate. So, looking back at other events, this, of course, was the other photograph. This is actually what landed in the town of Lockerbie, and you can see that huge crater there. This is where the main part of the fuselage fell, the wing portion, especially carrying fuel, landed there in a huge fireball, and you can see what a mess that made. But this is what I call a brief history of aviation security. The slide identifies some of the events over the past years that have led to changes in security requirements. It also highlights the need to truly learn lessons and respond quickly. For example, the method used to bring down Pan Am 103 on that day was used previously, 3 years earlier, to bring down Air India Flight 182 over the coast of Ireland. And it was this repeat event involving bombs in unaccompanied baggage that led to the requirement for baggage reconciliation, whole baggage reconciliation, PPBM, positive passenger bag match, it's referred to in some places. I'm sure many of you will have experienced the consequences of this when we're flying. I certainly have. That dreadful moment when we're sitting down with our seats buckled up, thinking about maybe what movies we're going to watch, what we're going to do for the next few hours on the flight. And just as we think we're about to leave, the pilot comes onto the speaker and announces, ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid it's going to be a slight delay, maybe 20 to 30 minutes. We need to offload the bag because the passenger hasn't arrived. And so we might think, well, why is that our problem? Let us go without the passenger. He can take another flight. But, of course, it's not as simple as that. The whole purpose of this is a measure that was introduced at the time to prevent exactly the kind of rogue, unaccompanied bag which then, of course, brings down the aircraft. And some of you these days may say, well, these days people don't care about dying in planes. They're happy to do so. And that is definitely a valid point. But the need to take bags off is still considered essential, at least as a deterrent to doing this kind of thing again. These are the two principal documents. There are many others, but these are the two principal documents we produce. On the left, you'll see the Annex 17 to the Chicago Convention. Annex 17 is security. That contains the standards and recommended practices, which ICAO sets out. And on the right is the Aviation Security Manual, which describes how these things should be done. It's important to note two things. Firstly is that the standards and recommended practices, which set out in very general terms what needs to be done, are for states to follow. ICAO sets standards for states. It is states themselves then that will delegate those responsibilities and task the industry, whether it be an airline or an airport, to do something in order to comply with those standards. Secondly, ICAO establishes only baseline measures. So Annex 17 contains the very baseline measures which need to be applied across the board throughout the world. Many states can, and many states often do, go beyond these minimum requirements and introduce additional measures or more stringent versions or stringent interpretations of these standards and recommended practices. It's not easy to see from those two-dimensional photographs, but this is Annex 17, as you can see, a fairly thin volume, as opposed to this one here, which, as I said, is the guidance on how to do it, which is 800 plus pages, just to give you an idea of the kind of level of documentation which is required. So Annex 17 says what needs to be done. This is some ideas on how to do it. It's not exhaustive, but it is appreciated, I think, worldwide as containing valuable information to assist states to implement the standards. How do we produce these documents? Well, especially Annex 17, let's focus on that for now. This is the policy development process. As you can see at the top of there is the ICAO Assembly, which is why we're all here today in Montreal. The Assembly is happening. The Assembly elects the Council, and the Council makes decisions regarding standards. But let me approach this from the bottom to start with, the working groups. How does that work? The AVSEC panel has a number of working groups. Let me see, for example, we have a working group on threat and risk, which will look at recent events, identify any new threats, and assess whether or not it considers those threats to be sufficiently mitigated. If they believe that there are some gaps that need to be filled, they will communicate with another working group, which is a working group responsible for Annex 17, and they will draft recommendations for the Aviation Security Panel to consider for new standards and recommended practices. Those recommendations will then be submitted to the Council through the Committee on Unlawful Interference, often known as the UIC, which may look backwards, but that's how it's referred to, the Unlawful Interference Committee. And then those will find their way to the Council. If the Council considers the proposals worthy of further consideration, they'll be sent to states for consultation and comment, following which the proposals are returned back to the Council, together with the comments for them to consider, again through the UIC, and if it is satisfied, it will adopt those amendments. In very rare cases, when measures are urgently required, Council can fast-track Annex amendments, skipping that need to consult states because it assumes that states will no doubt be in agreement. This happened twice in recent history. The first after 9/11, when clearly there was a need to do something urgently, and I'm sure there had been no dissenting voices for the standards introduced then. The second was following attempted attacks on cargo in 2010, when cargo security measures were introduced in 2012. Now, once adopted, the amendment is issued to the world. The new version of Annex 17 goes into effect usually 4 months is the specified time after it's adopted by Council. So the Council adopts on one date, 4 months later, it goes into effect. And 4 months after that, it needs to be fully implemented. And that final date is referred to as the applicability date. So adoption, effectiveness, applicability. 4 months plus 4 months is 8 months. Seems a long time, but it is necessary to make sure proper consultation takes place. It's a very structured, orderly process. Amendments may be issued every year, and recently this has been a case with recent events and the need to address certain threats. But generally speaking, in the past, it's been every 2 to 3 years that an amendment is produced. This is a photograph I'm sure you're all familiar with. I believe this iconic photo captures the importance of being proactive and decisive in introducing measures. Prior to 9/11, discussions had taken place regarding protecting the cockpit. Indeed, there is a link to be found between this photograph and the 2 earlier photographs of Lockerbie I showed you. Can anyone tell me what that might be? It's a very tenuous link, so I guess I'll better just explain it to you. Those discussions about protecting the cockpit were part of a study conducted by ICAO known as the ICAO, which is Incorporation of Security into Aircraft Design, which was established following the events of Lockerbie in 1989. Only in 1997, that's 8 years later, because these things do take time to get agreement, those discussions about protecting the cockpit door actually led to the introduction of measures in ICAO standards, and only in 2000 and 2001 we were still discussing the potential introduction of requirements to protect the flight crew compartment, otherwise known as the cockpit, from intrusion. But these discussions were inconclusive. However, following the events of 9/11, these measures were indeed introduced very quickly, as I explained to you earlier, using the fast-track process. Now, to be fair, even if these measures had been adopted in 2000, it's highly unlikely that all aircraft would have been modified with lockable and reinforced cockpit doors by the time 9/11 happened. But there is an important lesson to be learned here. Once a vulnerability is identified, we delay addressing it at our peril. Of course, before introducing new measures, it's important to consider the impact they will have, not only in achieving the required objective of preventing attacks against aviation, but inevitably, any new measures will have some kind of cost, almost inevitably. This may be a direct financial cost of purchasing equipment, of making structural modifications in an airport, often both may be required, or all three, or it may be related to staff recruitment and training, or potentially in causing delays to the normal operation of the aircraft, the airport's operation. Understandably, the aviation industry must consider its operational and financial viability, as must the states, before implementing these measures. As well as its duty to protect its staff and customers. But this has to be balanced against the potential impact of not doing anything until there is a major disaster. It's all very easy to do things after the event. We can look at this photograph and say we have to do whatever it takes to stop that. But we need to prioritize, of course. Once there has been a major attack, priority has to be to prevent the same kind of attack being perpetrated again. This also becomes a political imperative, where governments have to reassure their citizens that they are being protected from such events, and at that point, cost considerations take a back seat to the everything possible must be done to prevent a recurrence imperative. Measures that are implemented on an urgent basis may then become much more expensive than if they could be progressively introduced as part of a long-term planned process. So sometimes having to react quickly ends up actually increasing the costs considerably. Even more significant, however, is the potential cost of not doing anything until there's a major disaster. Of course, we need to prioritize. And if there has been a major attack, we need to prevent the same attack occurring again. So the cost is an important issue, yes. But it's not like in safety, where costs can be calculated. with reference to the decrease in a probability of a safety-related event. So let's say we find a certain event causes an accident once per million takeoffs and landings. By fixing that event at a known cost, we can reduce that probability, say one takeoff in 10 million one accident in 10 million landings. With security, we don't have that luxury. Because we're not talking about accidents, we're talking about deliberate attacks conducted by an adversary who is determined to find a chink in our armor. If we spend money to eliminate it, the adversary will simply exploit a different means of attack, and so on. So we will have wasted money, but we have to spend it anyway. So our challenge in security is we need to identify all these weaknesses before adversaries do, and at the same time, fix all those that are being exploited in the past. As is often said, there is no such thing as 100% security. So how do we prioritize? That is the biggest challenge we face. However, we should not be blinded by the fear of financial consequences of new measures in isolation. In both the above examples, it might have been possible to introduce measures that would have prevented them, based on previous experience and identified concerns. Understandably, such concerns need to be balanced against costs that could potentially threaten the viability of the industry, as I mentioned earlier. But these considerations need to be balanced against the cost of not introducing the measures. For example, the direct and indirect costs of 9/11 have been estimated by some to be over $3.3 trillion. I want to say it again, $3.3 trillion. That's with a T, not with a B or an M. And you can buy a whole lot of security for that kind of money. Ladies and gentlemen, I'll leave it at that, hopefully to leave some time for some questions. So I'd be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you very much.
Are there any questions? Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
So much for your presentation.